Hi, and welcome to Science Time with Sanika. In our last video, we learned about the basic mechanics of 3D printing. Today, we're going to learn a little bit about what it takes to print a three-dimensional object. We will be doing a little activity at the end, and you will need a couple programs and files. Be sure to download these from the handout before starting with the activity. Okay, so let's get to it. We've already talked about the hardware behind a 3D printer, so let's talk about the software. When 3D printing something, we use something called a slicer. Throughout this series, we will be using something called CuraSlicer, which you can see is open on my desktop currently. A slicer is a program that takes in your three-dimensional object and slices it into layers. The 3D printer will be able to print these layers as discussed in our previous video. So your slicer takes in a file in the format of an STL, which is a three-dimensional object. It converts this STL file into a G-code file, which is something that your 3D printer will be able to read and understand. So now let's walk through the basic parts of a slicer. The first part, which is one of the most important parts, is setting your printer. I'm using a Creality Ender 3 printer. And by setting my printer up top, it auto-populates the dimensions of my build plate as well as the height of my printer. We talked a lot about materials last week, and setting your material when you're slicing your object is also very important in being able to get a polished and properly printed three-dimensional object. There's a lot of things you can also do with your 3D printer. You can move your object from left to right and orient it wherever you want on the plate. You can also scale your model up and down. And then you can rotate it. When slicing an object, one thing to remember is orientation. A printer can't print in midair. It needs to have a stable base. So let's get to our activity where we can actually visualize this. And before starting the activity, make sure you've downloaded CuraSlicer and the files from the handout. The files are different objects that you can practice slicing with. And the handout also walks you through how you can download CuraSlicer. All three of these buttons are super important in understanding how to properly orient an object. So let's get to it. Practice orienting. And let's work on this first one together. This is a table. We normally orient our tables upright, in our houses, legs down, top up. But when 3D printing, we can't do that because parts of the printer, like the base of the top, will be printing in midair, and our 3D printer can't do that. So we're going to practice orienting this table. We're going to select the table, we're going to select rotate, and rotate it all the way upside down by dragging the red line. Now that the table is oriented upside down, our 3D printer will be able to print this properly. I wanted to show you one more thing before we get on to the rest of the activity. Say I want to move my table over. Say I move it a little too far over. Do you see how it's shaded? That means it's either off the build plate or it won't be able to be printed properly. Be sure to look out for the shaded or change in color because that tells you if your object's going to be printed properly or not. So this was our first little exercise. I'm going to put up the rest of the exercises. This is our next object. It's the bottom half of a sword. So be sure to pause the video before and try to orient this on your own. Now that you've come back from trying to orient it on your own, I'm going to walk you through how I would do it. I would first scale it down just a little bit so I can work with it a little bit better. And I would orient it top side down because the bottom has a flat base to work on. And this is how I would print it, so you get a perfectly finished product. Let's move on to our next example. Next item is Iron Man's mask. So pause the video to see if you can orient this properly before I walk you through it. Okay, I'm going to assume you have paused the video and done it. So let me show you how I would do it. First, I would move the mask onto the build plate. We see that it's a little too big to be printed because it's still shaded. So I would scale it down just a little bit so it becomes a solid color. Next, I would rotate it onto its side. While this might seem wrong initially, I rotate it onto its side because the inside is hollow. And on top of it, the bottom isn't one flush piece. So by rotating it onto its side, we're giving it a flat piece to print upon. You don't want to orient it onto its face because there's a lot of detail on the face. So if you put it on its face, you might lose a lot of that detail. This is the right way to print the Iron Man helmet. Now onto our last and final 3D printed piece to orient. Okay, so our last object to orient together is this panther. Pause the video to see if you can actually orient this properly. So this is how I'm going to do it. Just for you guys to be able to see it a little bit better, I'm going to scale it up. Then I'm going to rotate it this way. And then move it so it's fully on the build plate. So as you can see, just like the table, there's lots of parts underneath the panther that if we print like this, would be printing in midair. The panther also has texture on its sides, so we can't print it on its sides like we did the Iron Man helmet. Similar to the table, I'm going to flip this entirely upside down. By printing it upside down, we're giving it a flat base on the bottom to print properly, just like the table. So now you've understood how to orient and properly, in order to properly print a three-dimensional object. You can go to the website called Thingiverse to download your own three-dimensional files to keep on practicing how to orient objects. Thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for more videos in our series where you'll learn how to make your own three-dimensional object, which I will be able to 3D print for you. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for more.